Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be with you this morning. I truly appreciate Alzheimer's Australia, all of the leadership from Alzheimer's Australia, past and present, who have made it the organization it is. Certainly also thank the Wicking Trust for putting this together. And I especially want to thank you, Phil, and anyone else here who has a diagnosis, and all the carers and all of you who speak up, who take your voice and use your voice to change the very path of this condition of dementia here in Australia and the world. You've already heard from Henry about all the issues with the disease, the diseases that cause dementia. And I may well touch a point or two that he has already mentioned as reiteration of their importance in what is the background to what I'd like to talk more about, which is what's happening and how do we change that, especially as it relates to having dementia strategies around the world and to advancing research, especially the funding of research that you've already heard about being so terribly low. You know, just to reiterate, one of the things that Henry pointed out, all the diseases that cause dementia are not normal aging. And that wave of aging around the world is, of course, the driver to all of this. I reiterate that because it is so important to moving public policy with leaders around the world for them to understand that that is what is happening. Now, realistically, cancer, heart disease, blindness, most other chronic conditions are as a result of age as the biggest risk factor. But just to give you one really, I think, significant statistic about this aging of the world population. Within the next few years, by 2020, not clear exactly when it will occur, but by 2020, there will be more people on the face of this earth who are over 65 than younger than 5. For the first time ever in the history of the world. That statistic alone is the single biggest driver then of the dementia epidemic that we have around the world, and it is truly a worldwide problem. I would tell you, in fact, it may in fact be the single biggest health problem unresolved yet in the world, certainly among them, if not the biggest. I would also tell you, though, it is the single biggest opportunity in health around the world as a result. There truly is nothing else like it that affects so many, that has such effects on the people who have it, has such effects on the carers for the people who have it, yet has nothing yet that we can do to treat it or even slow it down. And finally, with so little invested in the research to change that course. And that is why we have to truly aim at what are dementia strategies in countries around the world and the funding to go with that research to make those changes. When you have as many people in Australia alone, 413,000 of you now, as you've now heard multiple times, going potentially to 1 million with no correction. In America, the numbers are comparable, and worldwide, you've heard from Henry, 47 million today, going up to 132 million by mid-century, again, if we don't turn the corner. In the United States, the costs today are $259 billion in a single year, US dollars. And if we don't correct it, it will be $1.1 trillion in 2050. Single year. One of the leaders in Congress who is a champion for us points out that right now is half of the defense budget, and the big number would be double what the defense budget is today. So the numbers are simply staggering. I will tell you, too, that in a recent report that we released with our facts and figures this year, much like your recent report at Alzheimer's Australia on the economic costs of dementia, we report on what is science advance with biomarkers and the kinds of data that Henry already spoke to, some people who have been estimated in Alzheimer's, for example, don't have the plaques we now know from certain studies, but they do have dementia, but others are not counted who have MCI and do have the plaques. So in fact, it's possible those numbers and the situation could in fact actually be worse in the totals. Dependence and disability around the world. Alzheimer's Disease International, which Robert and Henry have long been a part of, indicates that through their studies that in the cost as a result of the diseases that cause dementia, dependence as a result is the highest for dementia of any other condition, and in fact is roughly equal to the addition of arthritis, vision, stroke, and limb paralysis in terms of the dependence that dementia causes. So the impact, again, is just huge. RAND says it is the single costliest condition in America. All of these things, to the extent that I reiterate any of them and add to what Henry has already told you, again, I make the point on because it is the set of things I believe, and in our experience, and I'll talk about that in a moment, that can change the course by government action, by public policy change. Because when we talk about these things with leaders in government, we always have to talk about the very real impact on the individuals, the families, but we also have to focus on the effects on the cost to government to be able to get them to make the changes we need. One of the things I will say to you is that Janice mentioned driving the change in the discussion in America. I will tell you that the single most fundamental thing that you can do, that we can do collectively, that needs to be done around the world is we need to drive the discussion about dementia. Years ago, I've seen Henry reference this particular study in some of his talks. There was a study done that was reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association asking doctors, it was 1961, asking doctors if they told their patients when they made a cancer diagnosis. What do you think they did? Did they tell them? No, they did not. 90% of the docs in that study did not tell their cancer patient that they had cancer. Now that may seem unimaginable today, and all that had changed by the 70s, but I tell you that story to illustrate that not so long ago, cancer was not talked about. And even still today, though you're here to talk about it, we're talking about it today, too much of the populace will not talk about dementia, will not talk about Alzheimer's. It's treated still with taboo in many places. In the States, we have changed that dramatically. We have raised it to the point, I worked in cancer for many years. Cancer was always at the top of any list of the concern of the populace. Then a big drop to heart disease, then a big drop to diabetes, and a big drop to dementia, Alzheimer's in particular, because people simply did not talk about it. We have changed that in the US with very assertive and intentional work, such that now people believe that both cancer and dementia are comparable in terms of what needs to be done about it, not only what they believe they should do themselves, but also what public policymakers should do about it as well. And that, I will tell you, I think is the very most fundamental and critical thing that we have to change. So I will ask you to do, if nothing else, one thing walking away from here. Talk about it. Talk about it in every opportunity you get, in any situation you have, so that you yourself can actually be part of changing the course of the disease. If you look at the history of changes in disease over time, I can certainly tell you that in the United States, when cancer then became discussed, changes occurred. About 2/3 of cancer patients are cured today. We have very intractable cancers we haven't made progress on, but all of that occurred as a result of the public ultimately then demanding change, and we have to do the very same thing for Alzheimer's and all dementia. The biggest needs in dementia, Henry has talked about, so I won't dwell on a lot, but we have to have multiple approaches in the arsenal. We're not going to do this, as Henry said, with a single silver bullet. It's not going to happen that way. We need risk reduction. We need diagnostics. We need, of course, the best care we can get for people. And we, of course, need the treatments to go with that. But if you look, for example, at the changes that have been made in cardiovascular disease, it has occurred with all of those elements as part of the arsenal that both organizations like Alzheimer's Australia, the Alzheimer's Association, the research community, and public policymakers have used to change the very path. The kinds of studies that Henry talked about, the finger study from Finland and his new study, the Maintain Your Brain study that he's pursuing, can make a huge difference in what can happen in risk reduction. But there isn't, those studies are costly. There isn't the money to do enough of those studies today to save as many lives as we potentially can. Alzheimer's Australia has already estimated that with what we know, we could potentially save 261,000 Australians from that 1.1 million who might have the disease by just after the middle of the century, if we can execute those risk reduction behaviors. And we could potentially save even more if we can learn how to do that and make that work. In diagnosis, diagnosis is really, if you will, the very first step in care. And too often, not unlike what I described to you from that JAMA article in 1961, if that seems unimaginable to you today, that a doctor would not tell their cancer patient that they have cancer, about half of the people, as Henry pointed out, are diagnosed at the earlier stages of Alzheimer's, for example. That's true around the world. In high-income countries, it's about 20 to 50% of people who actually get diagnosed. The Alzheimer's Association in the US, we ran a study in the last couple of years that indicated that even of those who are diagnosed, only about half of the families are told. So that unimaginable statistic from cancer is actually regrettably imaginable today in a country like the United States. Scotland's done a very good job at raising their rates of diagnosis and still don't come very close at all to 100%. So we have real issues with getting diagnosis done in a timely way without something like a lumbar puncture, because I can guarantee you, Henry, it's not just Australians who don't like that. That's a worldwide thing. We've got to make those kinds of advances, and again, there simply isn't enough knowledge today, and there isn't enough money to fund the research. Care, of course, fits the same description. We're not doing nearly enough for care for people around the world, and that applies, of course, even more so in low to moderate income countries, but even in the United States, we just had a big win on getting care supported for people at point of diagnosis to have a consultation on how family members and individuals can deal with the disease that's underlying the dementia. And that is now a big advancement for us because we have not, in our system, dealt with that well at all. And then, of course, finally, in treatment, that's the one, as Henry said, if you could put all the risk reduction in a pill, he'd love to be able to do that. It's what we want, right? We are going to have all those steps, but we know even when we have those drugs, we have efforts to make in hypertension. Only about half of people in the United States, at least, take those meds. So we have issues before us of all types, and they all require better funding. Dementia research funding, as you already heard Henry allude, is by far underinvested in every country in the world compared to other investments that countries make in other chronic disease. Now, our governments in developed countries, in higher income countries, our democracies are not typically well equipped to deal with the longitudinal, the long term. They deal better with crises. When we have something that is communicable, we tend to get better funding much faster. Don't misunderstand me, that's a good thing. We need to do those things. Those things need to occur. But if you think about the comparison of what's funded in communicable disease compared to what gets funded in non-communicable disease, there is a very much slower timeline for the non-communicable. And in Alzheimer's and dementia, it has been absolutely terrible. Henry mentioned the World Dementia Council. I have the privilege to serve on that body. And we had a presentation from some people at McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm, in our last meeting. And they actually came to the conclusion that around the world, cancer gets 5 times more funding, heart disease 2.5 times more funding, diabetes twice as much funding around the world for the research that happens at the government level that goes to academic institutions, your fine research community here in Australia, and across the world. Now, in my experience, those numbers are actually lower by ratio than at least what we've experienced in the United States. When we started the work I want to tell you about here to change the course of this by getting more investment in the States, $400 million was going to Alzheimer's and dementia research, $6 billion was going to cancer. $3 billion to HIV/AIDS, $2 billion to cardiovascular disease. Now again, those fit those descriptions that you heard me give from the McKinsey folks, but even higher for cancer. And again, all that funding needs to occur. We never seek to get funding from someone else's funding. That is not the right path. But we can neither continue to tolerate what is that disproportion of funding because of the human impact of all the diseases that cause dementia, but neither can we sustain what are the costs to our governments as a result of dementia and all of the care it takes as a result of the effects of the disease. We then, in the United States, at the Alzheimer's Association, believed that we had to pursue what is a national plan to change this course. So I want to give you a few of the steps we've taken. They aren't necessarily the steps that would work in Australia. It serves perhaps or hopefully as a case study that we can utilize, that you can utilize. And we, I have to tell you, have much more work still to do, considerable work still to do. But we started by mobilizing many advocates. I know that happens here in Australia. We have hundreds of thousands of them by now, people like yourselves who advocate on our behalf and meet with members of Congress. You have a parliamentary system, we have a congressional system, but lots of similarities in these two advanced societies with democracies that serve us. One of them is, no offense to any of our representatives in either government, but I think the most frequent joke I hear members of Congress tell is on how hard it is to get Congress to do anything. It is not easy. It is a challenge to get them to move. In our Congress, in recent years, you, I'm sure know, and I know that in your own parliament, there have been strong polarities and back and forth and challenges, and in the U.S. Called gridlock to the point of not getting things done at all. But I will tell you folks, throughout that process, we have managed to make gains as a result of being, first of all and fundamentally, relentless. This is a relentless pursuit, folks. We don't change our pursuit no matter what the government is, no matter who's in government. We stay on course to relentlessly pursue what is this additional funding for research at the top of the list that is absolutely fundamental to changing this path. So in doing so, you heard we passed what is called the National Alzheimer's Project Act in 2010, signed into law 2011. We did that with bipartisan effort. The association worked very much directly with individuals in Congress, leaders in Congress, to write the legislation. And I will tell you, if it may be surprising, at the outset there was no funding in that particular piece of legislation, and we did that intentionally. We pursued it in that way so that it would not be at that point the controversy of how much. Instead, we went for requirement to create a plan. That plan then requires a report annually, report on progress, and an update to the plan annually so that the members of Congress see from the executive branch, from those agencies, what is being done, how well it's being done, and when it might succeed. I give credit to our counterparts in the federal government, and I have the privilege to sit on the council that was created to provide recommendations and oversight to this effort. And we specifically ask for those government representatives to be members of the council, which is a departure from what has happened previously in the states on these kinds of efforts. We sit together to talk about these things, and they approved what was a 2025 objective. As Henry has said, we set that one several years ago, Henry. It was ambitious then, and that was by intent. It's not by accident that it was ambitious, and again, I give credit to those members of the federal government who were willing to take that on to have effective treatment and prevention by 2025. That is challenging today, and in fact, as Henry indicated, at the World Dementia Summit that was held by the G8, that was adopted by the G8 countries to be their objective as well. And these things are important as baselines to move these governments to these outcomes. They don't guarantee it. It takes, again, that continuing relentless effort to make it occur. Then we began, as a result of that, to get some increases to research. Also, with our ongoing relentless pursuit from the association and all of our advocates, talking to many, many members. And then in 2014, we decided we needed still more legislatively to make this work. So we got the Congress to pass something called the Alzheimer's Accountability Act. That act aims specifically at something that we heard from members of Congress over and over. We would go to them to talk to them about raising the level of research investment, and they would say, well, but you know, I'm not a scientist, I don't know what to do about that. And we can't pick and choose funding Alzheimer's or dementia causes instead of something else. Okay, Mr., Ms., Member of Congress, we've heard you. We went back to leaders in the Congress and we asked them with us to put forward legislation, and did, that was aimed at having, at the National Institutes of Health, the scientists tell the members of Congress how much they believe they need in each budget year. So now, what we asked the Congress to do was to have the scientists tell the Congress how much they need so they'd know how much to appropriate. I'm proud to say, especially given that it is hard to get anything through Congress, we moved that in a single year. That is very unusual in the United States government. A good collective effort and some luck too, no doubt. But that moved in a single year, and as a result of that, last year we got a $350 million increase. We have now, as a result of some of those smaller increases on top of the $400 million I gave you as the base, and with the $350 million, raised it to about $1 billion. Before we moved on all this, I had asked our science team at the Alzheimer's Association to convene some eminent scientists to see how much they thought we needed. At that point, $2 billion. So we've only made it halfway to that, so we still have substantially further to go. But now, as a result of the Alzheimer's Accountability Act, the next ask put forward by the scientists at the National Institutes of Health is $414 million. We already have pending from the prior ask. You know, the Congress, not only is it tough to get them to act, they sometimes act slowly. So they pushed off what should have been the work that would have been accomplished by the end of last year. The fiscal year actually started September, end of September, so October. So they pushed that off. It's still pending in Congress, and we have a $350 million addition pending in the House, $400 million pending in the Senate. My net point there is that we have moved this during a time of gridlock, in a time where our political leaders were saying we had no money, but we have convinced them that, in fact, given all those data that Henry talked about and I reiterated, that it is essential for us to change this and change it soon. That, in fact, it is truly urgent that we do so. That we will lose another generation to the effects of the diseases, particularly Alzheimer's, as the leading cause of dementia if we do not act and act swiftly. So I just want to finally touch on the last couple of things, and then I'll close. The importance of sharing data that comes from these research efforts. If we're going to ask our leadership, and you're going to ask your leadership to add more resources to the research effort, we are strong believers at the Alzheimer's Association that these data should be shared. And we put our money where our mouth is. We've actually funded the ABLE project here in Australia to be shared in our GAIN database, the Global Alzheimer's Association Interactive Network, where we now have about 500,000 subjects who are in that database, where any researcher around the world can tap all of those data and create their own studies off of the research that's already been done. In the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative in the United States, we have seen multi-fold returns on investment as a result of sharing data, instead of only the researchers who were the original principal investigators having direct and easy access. We've also worked with the National Institute on Aging to create something called iDrop, the International Alzheimer's Disease Research Portfolio, electronic approach to having scientists and governments be able to see how much is being done on any given topic. We're still working to get more participation in that because we don't need to be wasting valuable, limited, underfunded resources when we have so much more to do. We don't need to replicate projects already being done for non-scientific purposes of replication, but simple redundancy. So all of those things are things we need to continue to work on more. If you don't know, regrettably, and our scientists certainly know this, it is not as common to share as it should be in the science community. And then finally on the drug pipeline, Henry talked about the drugs that have failed and why they might have failed, and I'm not the scientist, I won't go there in terms of why they might have failed, but I know this. I know that the numbers of drugs in the pipeline for Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia, you would guess, are far lower than all of those other chronic diseases. So in the end, ladies and gentlemen, I would tell you this is a very simple equation. We have a huge problem causing huge effects on humanity, devastating diseases for individuals and families, growing at proportions that are staggering, with costs to our economies that are unsustainable. To not invest in the research that can change that path so that we, even when we have failures of drug testing through clinical trials, we have many more opportunities and options in the pipeline. It's a fairly straightforward set of premises, but if you look at the success we've had in other chronic disease around the world, it points to high, perfect correlation with the investments made and the outcomes derived. If we can change that, and I believe we can, based upon what we've already succeeded at in the States, and some other smaller increased investments around the world, we need to see much more. If we can continue that, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, along with the dedication of the science community, our ongoing advocacy, we continue to push those things, we will achieve what is ultimately the vision of the Alzheimer's Association, which is a world without Alzheimer's and any dementia. Thank you.